Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the program tonight by the Alan and Joan Billner Center for the Study of Jewish Life. I'm Karen Small. I'm the managing director of the center and delighted to be able to introduce our special guest this evening and host this program. Tonight's event is the annual Abram Matlafsky Memorial Program funded by the Karma Foundation. And I would like to thank the Karma Foundation for endowing this program here at the Billner Center, and Sharon Karmazin, Dina Elkins, and Craig Karmazin, who are the board of the Karma Foundation. We really appreciate your support. And I wanted to let you know that Sarah Pertil and I were talking today, and this is actually the 20th program of the Abram Matlafsky Memorial Programs. And so we're very excited to have a special guest here tonight and to have Craig Karmazin with us as our moderator. And it's interesting, we look back to the first program that we had done, and it was a film about the life and times of Hank Greenberg, if you can see my poster. So we did baseball, the very first program, and tonight we're all about basketball. So it seems like a nice circle that we're completing for 20 years. Everyone who is joining us is muted, and you're going to stay muted throughout the program. This is a webinar style. If you have a question, please type it in the chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat throughout the program. And at the end, Craig will be posing your questions to Dan and looking through to see what hasn't been addressed yet. So please type your questions in the chat. We have also enabled the closed caption. I think someone just typed that in. So if you would like to turn that on for yourself, you can enable that. You'll see the captions running along the bottom of your screen. Tonight's program is also being recorded, and it will be posted later this week on the Billner Center's website for anyone who wasn't able to make it tonight, or you'd like to catch it again. That will be available for you. Today is Rutgers Giving Day, and of course we are a center here at Rutgers University. We appreciate the support of the community. We encourage your donations. They're all greatly appreciated, and they really allow us to do programs like this that are free and available to the community. So I will thank you in advance for your support. You can go to the Billner Center's website, which someone's going to type in the chat, and make your donations there. So thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Craig Karmazin. Craig grew up in New Jersey, and he now lives in Milwaukee, where he founded and is the CEO of Good Karma Brands, a Wisconsin-based media and marketing company which leverages the power of sports to build brands. Craig is also a minority owner of the Milwaukee Bucks NBA franchise, a trustee of the Karma Foundation, which I mentioned, and the grandson of Abram Matlafsky, whose name this program is named for. He serves on numerous charitable boards and is the founder of Children's Radiothon in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, which raises money for local children's charities. And Craig, we're really delighted to have you with us here tonight. And I'm going to turn the program over to you, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. So glad to be here. Although you went a little long on the bio, I said we could only go a sentence and a half, but so happy to be here because my grandfather would have loved this. I think I attended that first session you mentioned, and I haven't been at 2 through 19, but it's because I share his interest and love of sports. And I remember watching Knicks games with him, and there was two things that excited him, which were New York sports and Jewish athletes, but it wasn't in that order. Jewish athletes always were the thing that got him the most excited, and having Ernie Grunfeld on the Knicks was just like the most amazing thing for him as just a fan of sports and a fan of Jewish athletes. So it is amazing to introduce my friend Dan to you all tonight. He is an accomplished basketball player. He's an accomplished writer. He's a academic All-American from Stanford. He wrote the book By the Grace of the Game, which is a basketball legacy and an unprecedented American dream a story of his grandmother surviving the Holocaust. And Dan, it is so great to be with you tonight.
Craig, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Karma Foundation, to you, Dina, Sharon, everyone. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, well, and being here during March Madness with a New Jersey team back in the Sweet 16. How about that?
Love it. Jersey City is represented. And you said you're from New Jersey, couldn't live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was born and raised in Bergen County in New Jersey. I went to high school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so we have those things in common. But yeah, room for St. Peter's.
Yeah. And so it really is, it's an amazing story. And, you know, we all were called Tatala by our grandmothers, but something about your relationship with yours, you know, must have ingrained something in you to want to tell this story. I mean, I guess, when did you know, as a writer, that this was going to be that book that you were going to want to write?
Yeah, I always grew up really close with my grandma, understanding the profound impact that basketball had on my family. I knew my grandmother survived the Holocaust, lost so much family in the Holocaust. I knew my dad came to America as an immigrant and then became an Olympic gold medalist. So, and you mentioned my book's called By the Grace of the Game. I knew that basketball had kind of shined its light on our family when we really needed it. And growing up, I love to play basketball, but I also love to write, love to tell stories. And as I got older, as I understood our family story better, this is really the one I dreamed of telling. And so it took more than 5 years, to do the research, to write the book, to edit, to iterate, but it came out several months ago. And so it's truly, truly been a labor of love.
Yeah. And so when you were thinking about this from the beginning, was this going to be your story and your family's story? Because I think that's the thing that connected the most with me, is the 3 generations. And throughout, you're seeing you as a typical American Jewish kid growing up in Bergen County, your dad as an immigrant who's, breaking through into the NBA, and then your grandmother who, by the grace of who knows what, I mean, so many things that we'll talk about, surviving. Was that always the idea of how you wanted to tell the story?
Yeah, listen, I had to really think long and hard about how I was going to weave it all together, because it's so intergenerational, and my story is my family's story, in so many ways. And, I'm very honest about that in the book, kind of the history I always carried, the expectations I felt, the pressures I felt, the obligations I felt, that was all wrapped in. And so just tried to consider, how do I weave it all together? And so I ended up, I decided on a structure of kind of alternating timelines where I tell my grandparents' survival story, my dad's improbable ascension to basketball stardom as an immigrant, but also my journey, being born into privilege, having opportunities and resources my ancestors couldn't have imagined. And yet it's all connected through several themes, and basketball and Judaism being the main ones.
Yeah. So not to make this a therapy session, but since you were the one born into that privilege, did you feel like you had the right to tell the story? Or did you feel like, hey, I need Anya, my grandmother, I need my dad's permission, to tell this story?
So people have asked me, now that the book is coming out, what did your grandma and dad say when you told them I'm writing a book? And the truth is, I never said that to them. What I said to them is, I wrote a book, because I interviewed them for a year and a half, hundreds of hours of interviews each. I recorded them, I transcribed them, but I spent 3 years working on this project, kind of in solitude, without them exactly knowing what I was doing. And it wasn't because I was like pulling a fast one on them or concealing anything, but Craig, because you read the book, it's so deep and it's so personal, and there's so much rich detail. And I think I was able to go to that level of depth because I created a safe space for my grandma and for my dad when we were talking, but also for myself, to tell the story. And so, of course, once I was done with it, and, they were the first to read it aside from my wife. And so I always wanted them to feel comfortable, to clear it with them, for them to check the history, all these things. But, first and foremost, I wrote it because it was in my heart. I wanted to tell this story, and I felt that it was a story that other people would want to hear, because we all need something to believe in, right? We all need a dose of hope and inspiration, and seeing people overcome really serious things. And so I believe that there was an audience for the book, and that it could really impact people. And ultimately, once they read it, they agreed with me.
Well, it's amazing to have something to bring hope to people where the first words under the title is the Holocaust, right? So
It's true.
it's a topic that, people have such a, tricky and, unique relationship with. Everyone has such an individual relationship. So to try to tell an uplifting story with that as the backdrop had to be difficult. How did you paint the picture that you did? You mentioned the research, talking to your grandmother. Who else helped you paint that picture?
Yeah. So first I'll say that there's a lot of darkness in my family story, but there's much more light. Right. And so, yes, we talk about what happened in the Holocaust and we talk about other tragedy that happened in my family, but you cry reading the book and learning the story, but you also laugh and you smile and you pump your fist. Right. And that's how life is, and life is joy and pain and tragedy and triumph. And so wanted to reflect all that in the book because it truly is the nature of my family story. And so to your question, definitely my dad and my grandmother were my primary sources, but I talked to family members in Israel. I talked to family members in Budapest. I talked to family members all across the United States, leveraging kind of secondary sources like the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, Encyclopedia Britannica. I had to become an expert on, the political situation in Transylvania during World War II. This wasn't my, what my area of expertise prior to writing the book, but I just had to, it's like the biggest research paper I've ever done.
Right. So how did your family story not just end in Auschwitz, right? Both of your grandmother's parents die there. 3 of her siblings die there. We all accept, hey, Ernie Grunfeld, he was the player on the Knicks. He was the GM of the Knicks. That story was so close to never happening. How didn't the story end there?
Yeah, 100%. And it's amazing, for my grandmother in particular, because my grandfather was in a forced labor camp in Hungary, right? So he didn't have it easy by any stretch. He was a prisoner, but he had it easier than my grandma. And my grandfather lost both of his parents in Auschwitz and both his sisters. So he came home with nobody. My grandmother lost 5 siblings in total and both parents, right? So that's just a tremendous amount of loss. For my grandma, there are dozens of instances where if things would have gone a little different, the chain of events, like we're not sitting here today, I'm not here. And and as you know from reading the book, my grandmother was so disciplined. She has such a will to survive. She has such an incredible spirit, but she also has so much kind of humility and perspective because she's the first one to this day. By the way, my grandmother turns 97 in June, lives in the Bay Area, 25 minutes from me and my wife, is doing incredibly well. She's the first one to say that you could be all those things back then and it didn't matter. You needed luck, you needed help, and she had both of those things. And so, when her family was taken to Auschwitz, my grandmother happened to be visiting an older sister in Budapest. And so she had a chance to survive on the run. And as you know from the book, she's a very kind of dramatic survival story where Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, regarded as one of the greatest heroes of the Holocaust, saved her life twice in Budapest. There were she narrowly evaded a massacre in the Budapest ghetto. But, through kind of her will and a lot, the universe kind of smiling on her, she was able to survive it.
Right. You even say at times it may have been her blonde hair at times. That's, something that arbitrary. So you mentioned Wallenberg, as much as you wanted to tell this story, I almost get the sense that she just wants his story told because she feels like the way you feel like your story is this story. She feels like Wallenberg's story is her story, it seems.
It's true. And still to this day, like she'll shed tears about him, and she'll say he did so much for us and he saved us and we weren't able to save him because he was apprehended by the Russians after the war and never seen again. But he, and as you know from the book, Craig, it's so interesting. So the first way he saved my grandmother is he issued Schutzpasses, which were protective passports. So they gave Jews a little bit of protection, during that time in Budapest. And my grandma got one for herself, but she risked her life to obtain 17 passes for other people. So I always say my grandma is not only my hero, she is also a hero. And it's true. Eventually that passport was no longer recognized. She was captured by the Nazis. She was put in the Budapest ghetto. At the end of the war, she was reunited with her brother in the ghetto. They saw Nazis enter with machine guns over their shoulders, and word quickly spread that they were going to kill the remaining 80,000 Jews in the ghetto. Think about that number, right? At 80,000 Jews. And so they raced up to an attic space and they hid in there. My grandma says they were packed in like sardines. There was room for like 4 or 5 people. There were a dozen in there, and they waited for 10 minutes and 20 minutes and an hour. nothing happened. And soon the ghetto was liberated and they were free to go. And they didn't ask questions. They didn't ask why or how. They just left, and they were saved at that moment. And that was in 1945. In 1985, they made a movie about Raoul Wallenberg's life. And it was in that movie that my grandmother saw the scene of Wallenberg racing to the ghetto, confronting the general and telling him the war is over. You'll be a murderer. Let these people go. They're innocent. And he convinced them to call off the massacre. So it took her 40 years to learn that Wallenberg saved her life twice during the war. And yeah, he is her hero. And he is a symbol of what a true hero looks like.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so then the idea that she survives is amazing, but the idea that your family ends up in the United States almost seems, as arbitrary as like a teenage crush.
Yeah, it was, because my family spent more than 10 years under communism in Romania after the war, right? So life was hard, and it was the state of Israel that paid money for each Jew to be able to leave. And so my family, they fled communism as refugees, headed for the state of Israel. And my uncle, who was 8 years older than my dad, happened to be dating a girl in Romania who went to the United States. And so my grandfather said, I want to go to the United States. But my grandma always says, I could ignore him, but your uncle, I had to listen to. And so my uncle wanted to be in the United States. And so they had a stopover in Rome for 6 months before going to Israel. And they waited, and they were able to find a way to the United States. And so, yeah, if not for that, they settle in Israel.
Yeah. And the story, the escape stories and all that is why the book is just such a must read, and why it'll even be better in the movie. I guess the book is always better than the movie, right? But
Yeah.
but it's going to be amazing. So then your grandmother comes to the United States and, seemingly ready to launch a new life, and then deals with the biggest tragedy of her life, which is saying something when you've just survived the Holocaust, right?
It's true. And I say my family was living the American dream just by coming to America. They had a chance to work for a living, to raise kids, to have their kids have an education, to live peacefully. That's something they never had before. And so, they were in America. They had a chance, Forest Hills, Queens, chance to build a new life. Within a few months of arriving in the United States, my uncle, who, by the way, my dad called his brother, what he called him in Hungarian translates to English as my king. Think about that, to call someone my king. That's how much my dad revered his older brother and looked up to him. And so my uncle was diagnosed with leukemia a few months after arriving in the United States, and he passed away within a year, 17 years old. So you called it the biggest tragedy that happened to my family, and you're right. For my grandparents to survive the Holocaust, lose so much, flee communism, for my dad to be uprooted for his homeland, to get to America, and then for my dad to lose a brother, for my grandparents to lose a son. I write in the book, it's a hole that can't be filled. I'm named after my uncle. My middle name is Leslie, which was his name in English. And so, I take that very seriously. I always have. I've always felt a great obligation to kind of honor him, to live up to that. And so that's kind of the situation my dad found himself in. An immigrant in New York City, didn't speak the language, never touched a basketball, lost his older brother. And by the way, my grandparents, they had to work 6-7 days a week to make a life. So they opened a fabric store in the Bronx, and they were working all day. So my dad, he was alone a lot of the time. And so he found a way to spend his time.
Yeah, which is absolutely incredible. The thought of your father and finding that basketball, right? It's by the grace of the game, but he's still working at the store there. I mean, it's a very, almost feels like the common immigrant story, except for what your dad's turning into on the basketball court, right? So I guess, you tell the story in the book, and it's almost impossible to believe in this day and age when people are being recruited in 7th grade and they're going to camps and they're on all these travel teams, but I mean, your dad had become a pretty elite player, and his parents still had no idea.
It's true. It is. It's the quintessential immigrant story where they were working literally. My grandma worked 6 days a week. My grandfather worked 7. My grandma still says that, my grandfather, he worked so much at the end of the day, she would say to him, let's leave something for tomorrow. Let's go home. I mean, but it was an opportunity to build, and so they were building a life, and they knew that my dad was always at the park. He was playing basketball. He really liked it. It kept him out of trouble, but they didn't really think much more of it. And so they got a call my dad's junior year in high school. So he's 17 years old. They got a call at their fabric store, and it was his high school coach. And it was Queens legend Erwin Iser, is a very well-known coach in Queens. And he said, it was my grandma who answered. He said, Mrs. Grunfeld, you should come watch your son play basketball. And the reason they had never been to a game is because the games were in the early afternoon, and my grandparents would have had to close their fabric store. That was never happened. My grandma had to twist my grandfather's arm just to close it at 8:30 in the evening, right? They're not closing it at 4. But the following week, they closed the store early. They went to the gym, but they didn't close it early enough. And so the game had already started and the gym was full. And so the usher at the door said, we can't let you in. The gym is full. Game has already started. Their English wasn't good. My grandfather tried to kind of convince him. He said, we're parents of player, friend, guests of coach, but said, listen, there's nothing we can do. And for whatever reason, my grandma said, our son is Ernie Grunfeld. She just, kind of said it. And his eyes lit up. And he said, well, why didn't you say that? Follow me, and he opened the door and escorted them into the gym. And, they were looking around, and my grandpa nudged my grandma in Hungarian and said, well, if Ernie's so good, why isn't he playing? And my grandma still thought, she grabbed him and she said, look right there. That's Ernie. He was in the middle of the floor, but my grandfather couldn't recognize him. And that's so symbolic, the transformation, the evolution. Before his eyes, his son, who had just come to America as this little boy who didn't speak the language, who lost a brother, all of a sudden the tables had turned, and now, he had grown before his very eyes. And so on the court after that game, because my grandpa used to always make my dad come to the store on weekends to work, my grandpa told my dad, you never come to the store again. You just take care of your basketball. We'll handle the rest. And so a year later, my dad was an All-American, one of the most highly recruited players in the country.
Yeah, and he ends up going to Tennessee, and Bernard King, who just absolute legend of New York basketball as well. And he ends up teaming up and becoming the legendary Bernie and Ernie show. And then the Olympics is coming up, and your dad gets the invite to try out for the Olympics, but you're talking about the best of the best, and Bobby Knight, right, making these choices, or Dean Smith making these choices.
Dean Smith, yeah.
Dean Smith making these choices of the best of the best. I think your dad being able to make a team like that's amazing, but the story of his parents and how they learn, as immigrants, that their son is going to be an Olympian is just, it's mind blowing.
It was one of my favorite parts of the book to write, because I mentioned there's hard things, but you see this transformation. And my grandparents are at their fabric store, and the radio's on, and they know my dad is at the Olympic tryouts with the 80 best college players in the country. My dad's certainly one of them. He's a 4-time all SEC player, left Tennessee as the school's all-time leading scorer. Actually, to this day, he's the 5th leading scorer in the history of the SEC. So my dad was a role player in the NBA, but he was a legendary college player, legendary high school player. But still, this is the Olympics, and so they're in their store waiting for this announcement, and it finally comes, and they're reading off the names, and they hear, the United States Olympic team, Ernie Grunfeld from the University of Tennessee, right? And they survived the Holocaust. They fled communist Romania. Who in their wildest dreams could have ever even imagined that was possible? And they closed their store this time for 2 weeks, and they drove from Queens, New York to Montreal, Canada, and they got to watch my dad stand on top of the Olympic podium wearing the Stars and Stripes to become a gold medalist. Listen, why I called the book this, by the grace of the game. It truly is a miracle, and that's why I wrote the book.
But, most people around here aren't always happy with the decisions that the Knicks management is making. But we actually had someone ask in the chat about your mom. It also was by the grace of the game that the New York Knicks decided not to draft your dad, right? And your parents
That's true.
would not have met had the Knicks done what your dad and everyone was hoping they would do, and just draft him in the first round of the draft.
It's true. And so my dad knew coming out of Tennessee, he was going to be, between 8 and 12 in the draft. They had pretty good data from his agent, and the New York Knicks had the 10th pick. So for my dad, that's a dream come true. Come home to New York, play for the Knicks. And the Boston Celtics had the 12th pick. So he was thinking, well, if the Knicks don't pick me, you know, I'll go to Boston. It's close to New York. It's a legendary franchise. The Milwaukee Bucks had the 11th pick, and he never been to Milwaukee. And you know, it's funny to hear him talk about it. He just said, anywhere but there. You know, I don't know the place. You know, just keep me on the Eastern Seaboard. And sure enough, he's the 11th pick in the draft. He goes to Milwaukee, and you know, the first question he asked is, "Any nice Jewish girls in town?" You know, and so the first name mentioned to him was Nancy Kahn, who's my mom. You know, spoilers, but my grandfather Jerry Kahn was a kind of prominent lawyer in Milwaukee. Founded the firm Godfrey and Kahn, and he was a part owner of the Milwaukee Bucks in the 70s. And so, Craig, you and I both have Milwaukee Bucks championship rings, and that's true because my grandfather gifted me for my bar mitzvah the ring that the Bucks won in 1971. But yeah, you know, it was basketball and Judaism, Jewish matchmaking. You know, any nice girls? Yeah, Jerry's oldest daughter Nancy is pretty nice, and that's why I'm here today. Those are my parents.
But by the time you're born, your dad's playing for the Knicks. So
he's playing for the Knicks. That's right.
So you're born, you know, like I'm sure many of his teammates, he needed to schedule his bris for you around the basketball schedule, right? Like I'm sure a lot of his teammates had to worry about that.
Well, you know, in the book, on one of the first pages I wrote, you know, I'm sure thousands of Jews in New York City scheduled their sons' bris ceremonies around Knicks games. My dad was the only one playing in the Knicks game, you know, and that's the truth. I mean, I was delivered by C-section, and my dad had 2 long road trips. And so he went on one road trip, he was there for my birth, and he went on another road trip, and he was there 8 days later for my bris. And so, yeah, that I came in the world around Judaism and basketball.
Yeah. So then I mean, there's so much talk recently, and I know another book out about the 90s Knicks, but I mean, that was kind of like your playground, right? Like, I mean, you grew up a kid of the 90s Knicks and Madison Square Garden, right? Like, I mean, so that was your childhood.
100%. You know, so my dad played for the Knicks from 1982 to 1986. By the way, Bernard King, who you mentioned, his great teammate from the University of Tennessee, they played together for the Knicks, you know, which was an awesome kind of reunion. And my dad was quickly hired by the team when he retired to announce Knicks games, you know, to broadcast Knicks games on the radio, which is ironic.
By the way, now can be heard on 98.7 FM, a Good Karma Brands station. So
good plug. Tune in, everyone. Tune in. But you know, my dad, when he came to America as an immigrant, my grandparents wanted him to go to a yeshiva in the Bronx, and he was denied admittance because he couldn't speak English. You know, so here he is now. He's a legendary New York City basketball player who played for the Knicks, and he's broadcasting Knicks games on the radio. You know, that's this amazing transformation. But you know, he became an assistant coach, then the general manager of the team very shortly thereafter. So I was born into this kind of privilege, into this situation. And I, like you said, I grew up in Madison Square Garden, you know, running around the arena, getting to know the players. It was very cool.
Okay. So I know it's painful for all of us, but what, you know, was it the Charles Smith game? Was it the Rockets? I mean, what's the most painful one of the childhood there?
Wow. Yeah, it was the Rockets, you know, and so Craig's talking about the NBA Finals 1994. So Knicks were up 3-2 going to Houston, and I was there. You know, and so still to this day, you know, I went to the NBA Finals in Golden State, you know, because I live in the Bay Area a few years ago, and there were, you know, I call my dad, and the first thing we talk about is 94. You know, it's like it never leaves you when you're that close, and particularly for my family, my dad watching the Knicks as an immigrant, not speaking the language from the bleachers, you know, and then becoming a player and running the team. It truly was a Cinderella story. So being that close to winning it all. It was so heartbreaking, but there were a lot of moments that ripped my heart out with the Knicks as a kid, but more moments that you felt like you were flying. I mean, I've seen 19,763 people just losing their minds over basketball teams that my dad built in New York City. Coolest thing ever.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned having, you know, the pain also, and, you know, it's kind of crazy how it worked out. Your dad gets fired from the team, and the team he builds goes to the NBA Finals, right? So that's the last NBA Finals, you know, team for the Knicks, and the general manager who put it together actually got fired during that season.
Yeah, he was let go with 8 games left. They were kind of underachieving. He had made some controversial trades, and those players weren't playing as much, and so he was let go. They made the playoffs as the 8th seed. They upset the Miami Heat in the first round. Those players, it was Latrell Sprewell and Marcus Camby, they started to play more. Everything started to come together. They went to the NBA Finals. But my dad, you know, he'd already been let go. And it just kind of shows you the nature of the business. And my dad was always the type of person, and you know this, Greg, you know my dad, you know it from reading the book. His parents survived the Holocaust. They lost a son, they didn't speak the language. They built a life, and a good life in America, through hard work, treating people the right way. That's how my dad always operated, so he just always put his head down, always worked. He wasn't the type of guy who went to the media or talked about things. He just tried to do things. And so built this great team, was unfortunately let go early, but the proof is in the pudding. And, I write in the book, which is true, when they went to the finals, there were hundreds of people in Madison Square Garden at the finals games with Ernie Grunfeld masks on, which is true. I mean, they appreciated it. And listen, my dad wore number 18 for the New York Knicks as a player, right? He was, number 18 in Judaism, of course, a symbolic number. So beloved figure in New York. I'm so proud of what he did there. And the Milwaukee Bucks hired him a few months later. So where my parents met, where my mom is from, that's where we moved after my freshman year in high school.
Yeah, but it's interesting because as that happens, that probably ignited, it seemed, some of your inner passion to be great on the basketball court, and some of what you were all of a sudden thinking you could be as a basketball player, which, it's tough to go into the same business, to go into the family business, but it seemed like there was no doubt in your mind that that's where you were going.
No doubt in my mind. It's what I always wanted. As you know, I wanted to go to Stanford from the time I was in 7th grade, because my grandmother lives 25 minutes from campus. So that was a dream of mine.
Which, by the way, is fascinating, right? Because most kids growing up in Jersey, Syracuse, the Big East, like all that stuff's going on. I mean, that really speaks to that connection that you had with your grandmother, that you wanted to go, across the country to play basketball, to be close to your grandmother.
100%. And it wasn't something I was casual about. And from the book, like I wasn't a very casual person in the way I approach these things, but I was obsessed with it. I wanted to go to Stanford. It was a long shot, but if my dad doesn't get fired that year, I don't make it to Stanford. If I don't go to high school in Milwaukee, I don't make it. The basketball there was very good. I was really well supported in the community, but my dad getting fired, it did change things in me. And I'm honest about it in the book. There was a lot of anger. And so there's a lot of hurt from it. And, when you're young, you're motivated, you're passionate about something, you have an outlet. And I was very lucky that I had that outlet, and it was basketball. And so I just really committed myself and got to work and tried to make something of myself with the game that had done so much for my family.
Yeah, and we appreciate everyone who's dropping questions in the chat. We'll get to those in a few minutes. So if you want to drop a question in the chat, we will absolutely get to those. And so, one of the ways you got to Stanford was going and playing at a basketball camp, which, it just blows you away, right? There's 300 players at this camp, including LeBron James, and somehow you're the best shooter at the entire camp and having a career weekend.
Listen, I had good moments when I really needed them, and I performed very well at this camp. There was this big tournament at the end of the summer that was, again, like players like LeBron and Carmelo Anthony were there. And Stanford, I was one of their top recruits, but they hadn't offered me a scholarship yet. So I was very close. And the first game of the biggest tournament of the summer, and I write in the book, like, this is my chance, right? It's like either you get to Stanford, you fulfill your dream, or you don't. And in the first game, I had 45 points, which is the most points I've ever had in my life. And it's probably the only game that I almost blacked out. I just kind of lost my senses, and I came to, I was like, oh, I had a really great game there. Helped get me to Stanford. But again, it's all part of this,
and by the way, what percentage of wanting to get to Stanford to be near your grandmother was about her cooking? And what are for people, what are the meals? What were the go-tos?
Listen, if I hope you'll get a copy of the book, read it, gift it to someone you love. You'll read a lot about my grandmother's cooking, and it's well deserved. She is, she's just incredible, and she cooks with love, and you really do feel it. And my grandma always says to me, because I tell her, you're the best cook in the world, and she says, you should have had my mother's food. And my great grandmother was killed in Auschwitz, and so the meals my grandma makes for us and has always made are the meals that her mother made for her. Traditional Hungarian food, rontatouche, was like breaded chicken, almost like schnitzel, but the way my grandma makes it, it's just magic. Medzlevesh, which is sour cherry soup. Almash pita is like little apple cake. Like, she just does it all. I always tell people my grandma probably makes 30 soups and they're all the best soup you've ever had. So yeah, listen, I was very well fed at college and beyond, and it was a part of the reason why I wanted to be around her, but mostly it's just because she's just the most amazing, wonderful person.
Yeah, so sophomore year, you end up being part of the team that's #1 in the country for a lot of the year. Junior year, your game really takes off and you become an all Pac-12 player. You have this incredible season, but you also end up with an injury, a season-ending, potentially career-altering, or not potentially, an absolute career-altering injury. And we'll talk about Ray Allen. You got to hear the Larry Bird stories in the book. You got to, Buddy Hackett, probably the most important celebrity, in the book, in terms of his impact. But what I got to ask you, because we're in Jersey now, we're all with a bunch of Jersey people. My favorite character, is just a guy from Jersey named Frank. So
there you go.
Tell us about Frank from Jersey and what he means to you and the family.
100%. Yeah, Frank is from Northern Jersey, just like me. We were always family friends, when I was growing up. And
by the way, it's great that outside of Jersey, people call him Crazy Frank. People call him all sorts. In Jersey, he's just Frank, right? Nothing crazy Frank. About Frank in Jersey.
Yeah, he's just Frank. Nothing crazy in Jersey. Outside of Jersey, definitely crazy. Yeah, and I knew Frank was a trainer, and he was kind of unorthodox. And so when I went out to Stanford, Frank moved to the Bay Area. And so we became close. He came to all my games, and he would always tell me, you have to train with me. You don't know what you could be doing with your body, your mind. You have to train with me. And as Craig said, my sophomore year at Stanford, we were the #1 team in the country. We started the season 26-0. We won our first 26 games. So I'm saying to Frank, I'm doing all right here at Stanford, but I really struggled personally my sophomore year. I mean, I really had a really poor year. Mentally, I wasn't right. And I missed the last shot. As you know, during the NCAA tournament, during March Madness, we were the top seed in the West. In the second round, we were down 3, and I missed a 3-pointer at the buzzer that would have tied it. So there's just more heartbreak, and I kind of said to myself, you know what, Frank, I need Frank. I need to see what this is all about. And I trained with him one time during the spring, and I had never been pushed like that, physically, mentally. And so I said, listen, all summer, Frank, you got me. Take me where I need to go, and Frank says that 1 in every 7 athletes come back for more of his training because it is so grueling. I mean, you sprint sand hills, and I remember carrying buckets of sand and pulling people in sleds, and very unorthodox training pushed me to my limits, physically, mentally, everything. I mean, we'd finish the most grueling workout you could imagine, and he would tell me, you have one more lap, and then I would be done. And he would say, actually, one more, and I would want to strangle him, but he'd say, you're going to do this lap. And when you're done with it, you're going to know that you could have done it the whole time. He really was a genius at knowing how to keep widening the aperture of my mind on what I could do. And so all that training, it really hardened me physically and mentally. And so by the time I came back on campus my junior year, I was a different person, a different player.
Yeah, you were a great junior year, senior year. The fact that you were on the court and playing, a testament to your will and Frank's training to help get you back for your senior year. And so then you go undrafted, and the basketball journey could end then. But I mean, mentioned Maccabi games, mentioned you played in Israel, and you even ended up as a New York Knick. I mean, so when you think about your professional basketball career, what are the moments that stick out the most? Because I mean, any one of those would have been incredible.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the injury was hard. It was a setback for sure, but I had a successful 8-year pro career, and I write in my book, as you know, I'm probably the only professional basketball player who had to call his grandma to ask permission to sign his first contract because it was in Germany. So as soon as my agent said, hey, I got a great opportunity for you, it's in Germany, I didn't even hear the rest of it. I said, I got to call my grandma. And I did, and I told her, and I'll never forget what she said. She said, sons are not responsible for the sins of their fathers. Meaning you can't blame this generation of Germans for what that generation did. And she said to me, that's what people have done to Jews throughout history. They've blamed us for things. They've made assumptions about us. You're not going to do that to anyone else. And so she gave me her blessing. I had a really strong year there, but I played in Spain after that for 3 years. I won a championship. Whenever you win a championship, as you know, Craig, you were part of it, right? At the highest level, there's nothing more special than that when you work together with a group of people towards a common mission and you achieve it, right? I won a championship, so that was amazing. Winning a gold medal in the Maccabi Games in Israel, playing 4 years in Israel, playing for the team in Jerusalem, right? So for my dad to wear number 18 for the New York Knicks as the only son of Holocaust survivors to play a major American sport, then for me to play for Jerusalem, very, very meaningful. I'd eat dinner in the old city after our games, and just those memories, those experiences, being over there with my wife, I wouldn't trade it.
Yeah, I want to hit a few of these questions that are coming in, but real quick, you mentioned in the book that you believe your dad is the only child of a Holocaust survivor to play in one of the major professional sports, not just the NBA, but Major League Baseball, NFL, NHL. Since the book's come out, have you been connected with anyone else? Are there other stories that have come to light?
You kind of scared me, Craig, because I thought you were going to reveal someone else. I was like,
no, the Maury Povich show is canceled.
Yeah,
so there's no big reveals for you today.
And I write in the book, the research suggests, because I talked to the historians at all of the leagues, NBA, NHL, NFL, Major League Baseball, Jewish sports historians. No one can identify another athlete where both parents were Holocaust survivors. And if you think about it, that sounds incredible, but it was probably during the 70s or 80s, likely a Jewish person from Europe. Already the pot has shrunk considerably, to have both parents who survived, you kind of start to see. But no, to answer your question, no one has come out with someone else.
Yeah, the book will show you by the grace of the game. Great questions coming in. We'll just hit them all. Actually, we'll start with the start of the book, is the forwards by Ray Allen. How did you get to know Ray Allen, and how did he come to write the forward for the book?
So when my dad was the general manager of the Milwaukee Bucks when I was in high school, Ray was the star player of the team. He was a star shooting guard. And I was a shooting guard, kind of an up-and-coming player in Milwaukee. Ray was always very good to me. Give me pointers, give me a pair of shoes. Ray's just a great guy. And so he spent so much time with my dad, with our family. He's been to our house. But he didn't know that my dad's parents were Holocaust survivors. It's not something my dad talks about much publicly, right? Basketball brought him away from that really painful past. And so, but similarly, we didn't know that it was a mission and a passion of Ray's to educate people about the Holocaust. He saw Schindler's List in high school, and he was just moved. I think he was in college. He said, this isn't just a Jewish tragedy, this is a human tragedy. And so fast forward to 2016, Ray is appointed to the board of the Holocaust Museum by President Obama. And he's a true advocate. Every time his teams played in DC, he took teammates to the Holocaust Museum. And I've talked to some of those teammates, and they said it changed my life. Because you don't walk out of the museum the same person you walk in. And Ray shared that experience. He's taken people to Auschwitz. And when we connected and I told him about my dad's past, told him about the book, he didn't hesitate. He said, of course, I support. And so I always tell people, as much as I looked up to him in high school, and by the way, his jersey was on the wall of my bedroom. It was no joke. This is Ray Allen, and as much as I looked up to him then, I look up to him even more now, because he's a special person. And so I'm so grateful. And he wrote an amazing moving forward. So read the whole book. Start with Ray's forward, because it's truly incredible.
Yeah, people on this call have told me, like, oh my God, I just finished the forward and I'm already like, I'm so sucked in. Speaking of, we're talking about grandfather. I mean, my grandfather was always talking Danny Shays and Dolph Shays. So someone asked, any connections of your family? Did you run into the Shays in some great Jewish father-son basketball circles, even if the generations were off a little bit?
Absolutely. I had the privilege of talking with Dolph Shays in Israel during the Maccabi games where I played. My dad just looks up to Dolph Shays so much. My dad, some people say my dad is the second greatest Jewish player of all time, and he's proud to say, we know who the first is. There's no doubt, right? Dolph Shays, when he retired, he was the leading scorer in NBA history at the time he retired, right? So just a true legend, a real mensch too, a real gentleman. And so my dad loved spending time with him over the years. I got a chance to know him. I'm connected with Danny a bit. I haven't got a chance to spend that much time with him, but the Jewish basketball NBA circle is, fairly small. And so, definitely connected with those guys and look up to both of them.
Well, it's funny. You jumped into Alan's question already, which was who's the best Jewish basketball players of all time? What about college? Would your dad put himself up there as the best college player of all time? Because I think there's a pretty good argument there.
That's an interesting one. My dad is very objective. Like I was like, no one is less impressed with Ernie's career than Ernie. He's just kind of like, yeah, whatever. But I'm going to ask him because my dad, as I mentioned, he was a role player in the NBA. And he had a very solid career. He was a phenomenon in college and in high school. And I've had so many people from Knoxville, Tennessee reach out to me since the book came out saying, Dan, like, you think you know, you don't know. I had one person say to me, your dad's not a legend here, he's a god. Like, that's how big kind of he was there. And so it's a really good question. He had this remarkable career. I'll tell you something, Craig, though, because this is really cool. I had someone reach out to me a few weeks ago and they said, my sister went to your dad's basketball camp in Knoxville. And your dad awarded her like the Ernie Grunfeld basketball, which was like for the most important award in the camp. And she said, but my sister wasn't a good player, but there was a kid who was picking on her and who pushed her down. And your dad lifted her up by giving her this kind of prestigious award. And she said, when I read the book, I understood that more, because my dad came to America and was made fun of and was an underdog, so as great of a player he was and as legendary as he was, he really touched people just by the type of person he was. And so that's what I'm most proud of, but I'm definitely proud of like the career he had because it's incredible.
Yeah, well, that brings us to a great question that someone asked, especially knowing your dad isn't the most verbose or emotional typically, but what was your dad's reaction to the book? You said you got it to him early, and what was your feeling as you knew it was in his hands, and then what was his reaction?
So I was nervous. Yeah, I was definitely nervous because, first of all, anytime you're so vulnerable, it's your family, you care so much, and I'm telling his story, right? So you want to handle that with care. It's a difficult story. So yeah, there was a lot of apprehension to it. It was very hard for him. It was very hard for him, and there are things, of course, about the Holocaust, about losing his brother that he doesn't really talk so much about. And he is an emotional person, just not outwardly, and so it took time for him to process it. Ultimately, he was really grateful that I told an important story and memorialized our family's history. He was very, very proud of me, as a father, to see a son like spend so much time to write a book like this. But it was difficult, and it remains difficult because, like, again, basketball took him away from a lot of these things. And so this book has kind of brought it back.
Yeah. You mentioned how integral the Jewish side of this was every step of the way. Alan asked, how observant was your family, and did you associate with a Jewish community when you grew up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, bar mitzvah, going to temple, of course, for the high holidays, celebrating at home. And so, yeah, I grew up in a Jewish household. My grandmother, Anu, who's the star of the book, who's the star of our family, she grew up in an Orthodox household. That wasn't us. We weren't an Orthodox household, but we were certainly observant. After the Holocaust, things were complicated, right? And so my grandparents kind of had to reestablish that relationship. But being Jewish is the biggest part of who we are. It really is. It's so core to our history, to our identity. I'll tell you something that I learned through the research for my book. So my dad was being recruited so heavily by so many schools in New York City and the University of Tennessee. They basically lived in New York City to recruit my dad at this time. But something they did that was really smart is they enlisted the help of the Knoxville, Tennessee Jewish community to recruit my grandparents, because they said, Ernie doesn't really care that much at this age, but Ernie's parents really care. And so the Hillel from Tennessee, the synagogues, the Jewish deli, they were all kind of recruiting my grandparents to come, and it made a difference. So even the colleges, the smart ones, they understood like this really matters to this family. We need to let them know that he'll be safe here, he'll be cared for, and his Judaism will kind of be, celebrated.
Yeah. As we talk about your dad so much, we mentioned your mom and how they met. Question now, why didn't your mom get more love in the book? There's two parents. Why didn't your mom get more time spent on your relationship?
100%. And I write in the acknowledgments that I could write another book just about my mom, which is true. We're so close, and she's had such an amazing impact on my life. We talked about it. And by the way, it's not just my mom, it's my sister and it's my wife. These are three of the most important people in my life who they're not represented nearly to the the probability that they should be, to the proportions they should be. The book is dedicated to all of them, and when you tell a story, this is a vertical slice of our family story, and it really focuses on my dad's side of it, and in order to tell this to maintain this narrative arc and to tell this story, you have to make decisions. I talked to my mom about it. She was 100% supportive. She said, listen, I know how special I am to you. You know how special you are to me. You're telling a story right now about dad's parents, dad, you. And so that it kind of had to be that way. But yeah, those are decisions you have to make. But again, it's my mom, it's my sister, it's my wife. The book is dedicated to them.
Yeah, let's go back to Israel for a few questions. Did you follow the U Maccabees at all, especially Ryan Terrell?
Absolutely. I know Elliot Simon's the coach a bit, supporter, fan. I think it's been amazing what they've done. So much great publicity, right? It's just so cool to see the attention they've gotten. And there's so much pride around Jews in sports who succeed, right? And and it links to Israel because I played, 4 years in Israel, played for Hapoel Jerusalem, Maccabi Tel Aviv, right? The basketball team in Israel. It's not just a basketball team. It's an institution. It's a national treasure because they won the European Championship in the 70s, and it was a team from Israel kind of taking on the rest of the world, right? And there's something about the Jewish people, what we've been through, where we come from, that really gives a great sense of pride when you see Jewish athletes succeeding. To your point, Craig, why the grandparents always love to talk about, who's Jewish and who's succeeding and all those things. And so love seeing what they did. I know Ryan Terrell just declared for the NBA draft. My fingers are crossed. I wish him nothing but success and to kind of follow that path. And so I think it's just a great story.
Yeah. How about Tal Brody from Trenton, New Jersey, who brought the game of basketball to Israel, documentary On the Map?
On the Map. That's right. The University of Illinois. Tal, talk about a real gentleman. My dad calls Tal the Jerry West of Israel, which he is. He was an NBA caliber player who made his career in Israel. He is just an icon there and just a wonderful, wonderful person.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. All right, I gotta kind of wrap this up with one question, which is, you mentioned the vulnerability, like to put this all out there and to really do this. And, you had to have had some kind of goal in mind, even if you weren't totally sure what it was. But like now that the book is out there, do you feel like it's accomplishing what you wanted to accomplish when you spent those 5 years on this project?
I always said that there's a truth here. There's a truth to this story because I always felt it, and I just wanted to convey that truth. I wanted people to experience the story as I had experienced it over the course of my life. And so I drew such a sense of inspiration from my family story and from what my grandparents overcame, from what my dad overcame. It's probably why I set that audacious goal to go to Stanford, right? I kind of had the luxury of dreaming big because I had seen what people had done in my family in the past. And so I think deep in my heart, I wanted to just tell the story, but I wanted people to be inspired, to have that feeling of hope, to put down the book and say, things are possible. There's more light than darkness. And I do think the book has achieved that because the response has been so great. And every day I get emails from people around the world I've had people who have relatives who are ill. The book is helping them get through that. I have people who are watching the news today and seeing these horrific images of innocent people, their lives, being taken, families being separated, and reading this book and seeing the hope that can come after these type of tragedies has been uplifting. So that's my dream for the book, and it is happening. So it's wonderful, and I just want to keep pushing them. I want more people to read it and engage with it because I do think it's our story, but it's a relatable, universal human story.
And amazing that Anya is still alive and still, able to see the impact that her messages of love for all people, are making on so many. And you can certainly try to pick up By the Grace of the Game at your local bookstores. It is available at Amazon.com. It is absolutely incredible. Dan, thank you so much for sharing this story with the world. Thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. And I'm going to send it back to Karen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Craig. This was great.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dan, for being here with us and sharing this story. And Craig, That was amazing. Listen, I can't talk basketball with anyone. So, that was awesome. Thank you so much for doing that. And actually to your mom, Sharon Karmazin, for telling us about the book and making this program possible. So we really appreciate it. I know everyone out there, we had a really, really nice sized audience, but a really diverse audience of all kinds of people in New Jersey, teachers, students, Rutgers alumni, Rutgers students out here, our fans, our friends. So it was really terrific. And we thank everyone for joining us so much. I want to give a shout out to the Bildner Center staff who made this all possible. Sarah Portilla, our program coordinator, Darcy Marr, our communications coordinator, and Gabriel Duke, our event assistant who does the behind the scenes part here with our Zoom calls. Really appreciate them making this happen and making it all possible. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Dan and Craig and the Karma Foundation. And I wish everyone a good night. Thank you.